This week's guest is another Memphis music icon, John Frye, the owner of Ardent Studios. I'm Mitch McCracken, and this is Memphis Music Interview. John Frye has been involved with Memphis music for years. His Ardent Studios has survived while others like Sun Studios and Stax have fallen. John talks about Led Zeppelin, ZZ Top, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and Big Star, and their contribution to Memphis music. John, I remember when I was working at FM 100, we did a live broadcast with Wishbone Ash from Ardent.
We still have the old transformers from the equalized phone lines.
That was a big deal at that time.
Yeah, we made the phone company give us full bandwidth telephone lines.
Wow.
From here to FM 100.
Right.
And we did a whole series of these broadcasts, and they were live. I mean, there was no pre-delay, there was no cutting anything out. Whatever the people did is what went on the air.
Right.
And we never had any incidents, I'm pleased to say, but we did Wishbone Ash, as you point out. We did Leonard Skinner one, part of which actually wound up on one of their albums.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, the Wishbone Ash is bonus tracks on the Argus CD now.
Yeah.
So
a lot of that stuff sounded really good.
It did, especially the Phoenix. I remember that was like,
Yeah.
it went on forever. But so Leonard Skinner, when did you do Leonard Skinner? What year was that?
It was probably in that same time window. We kind of did a series of them that spanned maybe, year, 18 months.
Right.
And then it kind of petered out for reasons that I don't remember. One of the strangest ones was Martin Mull.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. He insisted on having a fireplace, so we made like a fake fireplace by having somebody draw it out. And he had to have something else. Now, this is for radio,
Right.
not television.
Yeah.
And he insisted on being introduced on the air by a midget.
Really? And who'd you get to do that?
We got a guy that was one of the little people whose name won't come to me now, but he was glad to do it and did a great job.
Wow.
And we would always have a small live audience, maybe 30, 40 people.
Right.
And, it was fun.
Yeah, I'm guessing that was about the time he had the album out called Let's Get Normal.
Probably. All of this was in the 70s somewhere, probably, the mid-70s kind of.
He's a strange guy. Well, let me ask you this. What made you decide that you wanted to have a recording studio?
Well, like a lot of people who have wound up in the music recording business, my initial interest was in radio. When we were kids, and I mean 12, 13 years old, we were fascinated with music. And, of course, the radio, and to some extent television, was what brought you the new music.
Right.
All pre-internet, all, can't Google it up. And so, I love music. I was a huge music fan. But I also wanted to know how this technology that brought this stuff through the airwaves to me worked. And I dug in, found out something about that. Me and some friends started getting some primitive gear together, figuring that we were going to fix us a little pirate radio station. And we did. Fortunately, it wouldn't go very far, so we didn't get arrested. But then we figured out if we had this equipment, that we could also use it for actually recording music. And that was at the time in the late 50s that everybody was starting a band. Every kid in high school was buying a guitar, drum set, or a bass, and playing it with varying degrees of success. And so we would record these bands and artists and issue 45s on a local basis. And we even had a few that did all right. It actually sold. We had one band that was kind of a frat band with horns from Ole Miss called the Downbeats. And they had a record that actually charted pretty good on WHBQ at the time, and we sold a few thousand copies just in the immediate area.
Wow. So was that the first recording you did, or?
It was close to it.
Uh-huh.
The first Ardent 45 was issued in 1959.
Wow.
Recorded in a studio. Everybody always says it was a garage. Well, at one time it was a garage, but it had been closed in, and it had heating and air conditioning and all
Right.
the amenities.
Right.
But it was a home studio before there was any such thing, and so we had the first 45 in 59, and the downbeats probably came along about 1960.
Mm-hmm. Eventually, you got to where there were a lot of people that didn't necessarily record here that had you doing the mixing for them. Like, didn't you do mixing for Led Zeppelin?
Well, I didn't personally.
Right.
Terry Manning did that,
Right,
but Led
right.
Zeppelin 3 was finished and mixed at the old Ardent on National Street.
Mm-hmm.
And the circumstances were that Led Zeppelin had done most of the album at Olympic Studios in London.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a U.S. tour schedule and a U.S. release date scheduled. They didn't want to cancel dates or move anything back. And Jimmy Page and Terry Manning were kind of buddies. So they worked out this scheme that they'd go ahead with their tour when they didn't have dates. Somebody would come into Memphis and they would wrap up the album.
Mm-hmm.
So that was how Led Zeppelin 3 got created. We started out mainly just doing mixing for Leon Russell for his records and other people on the Shelter label.
Mm-hmm.
But and I was doing all that myself, and that progressed into actually doing some studio sessions.
Mm-hmm.
We did a Freddie King album, for example, for Shelter
Mm-hmm.
that had all the A-list LA players. He just brought them out.
Right.
And it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, you didn't do but one or two takes and you were done.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, speaking of Leon Russell, Don Nix told me to tell you hello.
Amen. Well, I mean, he was responsible really for turning Leon on to Memphis and what was going on at Ardent, because he would go out to L.A. and hang out with all those guys.
He said that there were three people that without them he would have never been anything, and it was you, Leon Russell, and Jim Stewart.
I've heard him say so. He's probably wrong, but
Well, in his heart, it's those three people. How did you draw so many people to Ardent outside of Memphis to come in to record?
well, I've been doing this for 47 going on 48 years.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience is the best advertising you can have is word of mouth
Right.
from a satisfied customer.
Mm-hmm.
And the second best is that little tiny credit line on the back of a record that happens to be a hit.
Right.
So, those things speak louder than buying, $1 million worth of paid advertising.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, the Vaughan brothers and Stevie Ray Vaughan have recorded here.
And Jimmy Vaughan on his solo records.
Right. So how'd that come about?
Well, it started with Jimmy, and I honestly don't remember what brought Jimmy.
Mm-hmm.
But that evolved into Stevie Ray coming here for an album, and then they did, together, they did the Vaughan Brothers, which
Right.
was the last studio recording that Stevie Ray did before his death.
And then he recorded in step here too, right?
Yes.
Now, outside of the artists who record here, you have a lot of talent sitting in the chairs behind the boards here at Ardent. People like John Hampton.
That's one of the things that when you get to my stage in a career, that you can kind of look back and be the happiest about.
Uh-huh.
And that's all the people that have, sort of grown up here, been, if you will, been discipled here.
Uh-huh.
And that started out very early on back in the 60s when we got the old studio on National Street. There were no engineering schools or anything like that
Right.
that existed at the time. No place for anybody to go. No, vocational degrees, no four-year college degrees, none of that. So if you wanted additional engineering talent, which we did because we were getting busier and busier, at the beginning, the only three people who could engineer were me, Jim Dickinson, and Terry Manning.
Mm-hmm.
And Terry had been a player in a band that was on our little label, and he had kind of, learned engineering through apprenticeship. And then we had some other people that did that at National Street. A couple of members of Big Star, Chris Bell and Andy Hummel,
Mm-hmm.
Richard Roseborough,
Right.
who did a lot of stuff. And, then later on there's, as you mentioned, John Hampton, Joe Hardy, Paul Ebersold,
Mm-hmm.
Jeff Powell, Pete Matthews, who came to us, while he was still in college at U of M. In that regard, we have a lot of success stories.
How come you've had so much history when other studios have kind of come and gone? Ardent and Royal are about the only ones that's been here for.
Yeah, and of course, you could say Sam Phillips Recording Service, which is kind of a descendant of my
Right.
son, because
Right.
it's the same family. But, well, I would say that, first of all, we've been fortunate and we've been blessed. Also, we always had things that we did other than just fee-for-service recording studio work.
Mm-hmm.
We had a music publishing company, gradually built up a fairly nice catalog, had record labels or production companies of one kind or another, where we would do artist development and then try to move the artist on to a larger label. We did that in the late 80s and early 90s with Tora Tora and Eric Gales, and I guess the first one we did with Keith Sykes and John Hampton producing was John Kilzer.
Mm-hmm.
And then starting in 1995, we had a contemporary Christian music label that's now put out, over 50 albums over that span of time.
Wow. So that's so you got into all areas.
True. And in other words, we had enough diversification. And also at various times film and video.
Mm-hmm.
In the late 80s and early 90s, we had a pretty extensive operation. Then we elected to get out of it because a lot of the equipment was becoming so unbelievably expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But in the last 18 months or so, we've gotten back into it. We have this great guy, Jonathan Picard, who's a USC film graduate,
Mm-hmm.
and is coincidentally the son of Ron Picard, who was the one who designed and made the Big Star Neon
Right.
back when he was teaching at Memphis College of Art,
Uh-huh.
and designed the Ardent Records label from the 70s. And Jonathan kind of grew up around the studio as a kid because his dad would come here all the time. And he loved Memphis and wanted to get back here. And really the main motivation he kept citing for just being eager to get back here was his love for Memphis and everything connected.
Yeah, I met Jonathan. I worked with him on a project he was doing with Free World.
Right.
So that's another area that you've got a lot of talent in.
True.
So now how involved are you now as far as the actual recording goes, or are you more managing the studios, and or do you still get roll up your sleeves and get into the producing and engineering?
My role is mainly management now,
Mm-hmm.
and has been for some time. As the company got bigger, and as we had more and more, really competent guys coming along,
Mm-hmm.
that was just sort of a natural shift for me. And about the only time I've gotten back into doing any active mixing is when there's some of these reissues, like some of the recent Big Star reissues.
Mm-hmm.
And usually a guy named Adam Hill and I will do those together. I've kind of showed him everything about how we did everything in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And oddly enough, we've still got the original equipment, like for the Big Star stuff. We've got the original echo chambers and EMT machines and a lot of the outboard gear that still works.
Uh-huh.
So And we never remix anything where there's an authentic remix from the 70s, at least with regard to Big Star.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Big Star box set, there were 6 things we found on multitrack, and there were no stereo mixes from the 70s. So we had to try to recreate and make those match the rest of the stuff in the album and not stick out like a sore thumb.
Right.
And then for this Big Star movie, the Big Star Story, Nothing Can Hurt Me, we did a whole lot of mixes for the soundtrack.
It may seem a bit familiar to you if you are a fan of that 70s show. So John, why do you think out-of-town artists come here to Ardent? Is it the Memphis sound or is it your staff?
Some of them are coming to work either with a particular engineer producer or to use some of our great Memphis musicians and vocalists. Some are coming because they're fans of other things that have been done at the studio and they are looking for that same vibe, if you will. And as a larger issue, some are coming because they're fans of Memphis, all things included, and Ardent happens to be one of those things.
Right.
And you can't underestimate the power of that. I mean, you mentioned Jimmy Vaughn. He was always one that cited it. He said when he was here in Memphis that he just felt the creative juices flowing more. And, you know, a lot of people will say, well, that's bunk. But, you know, it's perfectly real if that's what happens, and that's the feeling and the energy that are engendered in that person, then it's real as all get out.
Right, right. And, you know, everybody I talk to, I ask them their take on Memphis music and what makes Memphis music so different than say, like L.A. or New York or Seattle or some of the other cities that are known for music. What do you think is the difference here?
Oh, we're a bunch of misfits.
You know, that could be it. That very well could be it.
You know, there's always been, I think, a competence here combined with a kind of rebelliousness or willing to try new things. And, you know, if you look at all the different entrepreneurs, you know, you'll, I think, see a pattern of folks behaving that way.
Right.
Now, I don't know what causes them to behave that way more so in Memphis than they do anywhere else, but they do.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've had our own little experiences of that. For example, with the Big Star records, in the 70s, the rock press just ate it up. You know, got enough ink to, you know, use up a few barrels of ink.
Right.
But that didn't much get records into the stores or get them sold. And our distributor was Stax, who was going through Columbia, which never worked for Stax, and it never worked for us. And you know, it wasn't long before that whole dysfunctional relationship, Stax Columbia and other things, brought Stax to its demise.
Right.
But in any case, the Big Star records were popular with the rock press, and they were popular with the FM stereo stations that were just emerging, which almost nobody listened to,
right?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah.
So you know, it only reached kind of the you know, true insider fan at that time. Lay dormant till the late 70s, and then started off kind of a word of mouth identity of its own that's continued until today. And as I alluded to before, when you're talking about late 70s and into the 80s, you're still talking about the pre-internet age. For the word to get around, it's much more difficult.
Right.
It really is word of mouth. It's people sharing bootleg cassettes. It's you know, it's all of those things.
Right.
And in the case of Big Star, a lot of it was really fed back from the UK and Europe into the United States.
Now, let me ask you this. How big was the rivalry between Alex and Chris? Did Did they blow that out of proportion? The reports of the rivalry between the two, or were you aware of it?
I wouldn't call it a rivalry. I mean, I thought as long as they were working together, I thought they had a great working relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, as Jody says in the documentary, part of Chris's leaving the band was his bitter disappointment at the lack of success of number one record.
Mm-hmm.
Another component was the fact that the press, because of Alex's previous affiliations with the Box Tops and all that,
Mm-hmm.
had really, sort of picked up that thread and run with it. And I think to some degree he thought that had he stayed on, he might wind up sort of living in the shadow of that forever.
Right.
And he went out and did a bunch of solo material, which lay dormant for a really long time, but now is available in very good reissues.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alex's vocals were so different between the Box Tops and Big Star. I mean, you almost couldn't tell it was the same person.
True. Well, in Big Star and some of his other recordings,
Mm-hmm.
he was basically singing in what was his natural singing voice.
Mm-hmm.
All of that Box Tops gruff stuff
Mm-hmm.
was a production idea.
Right.
Where they said, do it like this,
Yeah.
Alex. And, Alex was 16, so it's kind of like,
He did
okay,
it like that.
Yeah, I'll do it like that. And, he has a huge hit on the first record, so it's like, well, maybe we keep on doing it like that.
Yeah. That formula works. So yeah, and that was the Box Tops recorded over at American, right?
Well, I think, if memory serves me correctly, that the letter may have been done down at Muscle Shoals. But subsequently, they did most of the recording using the American rhythm section,
Mm-hmm.
not the traveling
Right.
Box Tops band.
Uh-huh.
And, starting with the string and horn overdubs and the mixing for Cry Like a Baby, Dan Penn would do all his finishing work at Ardent for as long as he continued producing.
So tell me, John, how long did Dan Penn record with you, or is he still doing that?
No, he hasn't in a very long time. Basically, he was doing some work at Ardent, as I said, mainly finishing work, where he would, put on his horns and strings and do his mix
Right.
at the old Ardent on National Street. And that pretty much lasted for as long as the Box Tops franchise ran on.
What other projects did you have hands-on experience with?
Well, again, it wasn't hands-on for me because Terry Manning and later John Hampton and Joe Hardy did it. But, one of the most notable ones is ZZ Top. We did their 8 best-selling albums. The Little Old Band from Texas was really kind of the Little Old Band from Memphis as far as the recording was concerned. All of that started up after they had made their first record, which they recorded somewhere down in Waco, Texas, or someplace
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
And weren't hugely happy with the way it sounded. And they would come up here and play shows fairly regularly over at the Overton Park Shell.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of heard about Ardent, heard it was a nice studio and all that kind of thing. So from the second album, on through their 8 best-selling albums, they did all the recording and mixing here at Ardent in Memphis.
A lot of their success was because of where they were recording their records.
Well, their music was great and their playing was great, and I think they probably could have recorded anywhere. But again, they felt an affinity for Memphis, and they enjoyed being here. They enjoyed the studio experience. They enjoyed the experience of the city, and it kept them returning.
I worked at a radio station in Beaumont, Texas, in 1973 or 74, and they were that's the area that came out of Houston, that area in Beaumont, and they used to play the blues circuit down there. That was after their first album, though. We played that at FM 100. Now, Jim Gain, was he staff here, or did he just do projects here?
Jim just did projects here.
Okay.
And, he came from an interesting background. Both he and Ronnie Capone, who wound up at Stax and then with Steve Cropper at TMI, it came out of what was, it had several names, but it was Pepper, and then it was Pepper Tanner, and
Right.
then it was Tanner, and it was a jingle company.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they cut their teeth before they went into doing recording for records.
Mm-hmm.
Ronnie, unfortunately, has passed away some years ago, but Jim is still active and does projects here from time to time, and has a huge discography of people that he's produced.
Right. Yeah. I went out to his house out by Pickwick
Yeah.
and sat and talked to him and Sandy Sandy Carroll, his wife. But they are really, really good people. Jim Dickinson was on staff here for a while and then kind of did his own thing, but still went through here, right?
Jim was the first guy who was ever introduced to me as being an independent record producer.
Mm-hmm.
And this was back in the home studio days, in the, maybe around 63, 64. A fellow named Bobby Fisher, who had music stores, I think maybe still has one, brought this band over to the home studio and said, well, these guys sound pretty good. Well, let's record them. And he said, well, maybe they need a producer. And I said, well, where do we get one of those? And he said, well, I know this guy, Jim Dickinson. So Jim came over and, kind of liked the guys and liked the setup. And he produced, the first little 45 that we put out on them and several others thereafter.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we opened up on National Street at the end of 1966, beginning of 67, he came on staff as kind of an engineer, producer in residence. His wife, Mary Lindsay, was our first office employee.
Mm-hmm.
So they were really the first two, paid employees on National Street. And Jim stayed until sometime in 68 when the Atlantic people were putting together the Dixie Flyers rhythm section in Miami because they wanted to be able to record a lot in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
Probably when it was wintertime in New York. And so he went down there with the Dixie Flyers for the duration of that, wound up making a solo album that was released on Atlantic, which I mixed here when recorded here, called Dixie Fried.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's recently gone into reissue or is in the process of being reissued.
Mm-hmm.
And is a real interesting record.
Yeah, he was really talented, and I just interviewed Reba Russell, and she was talking about some of the quotes that he had given her, and his of course with Amy LaVere. He did I saw a YouTube interview with him talking about producing Amy's record. So plus he won. How many years in a row, best producer? It was like, 4 or 5 until he took himself out of the running.
Yes.
But,
Well, I mean, he was, as you can look at his huge list of accomplishments, he was a talented instrumentalist,
mm-hmm.
Certainly a talented producer, for sure had a colorful way of expressing himself.
Yes, he did.
And I was just talking to Mary Lindsay Dickinson on the phone this morning while I was driving in, and there's a book that Jim started writing before his death, and that she and the sons kind of finished up. And
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of editors are working on, sort of condensing it and getting it into form for publishing. She's got a publisher lined up, and of course, it's a musical family. The boys, Luther and Cody, are really making some noise with all of their different groups, North Mississippi All-Stars and Hill Country Review and so on. I mean, new North Mississippi All-Stars, World Boogie is Coming, is getting ready to release, and, already has some videos on the various outlets. Those kids spend a lot of their time growing up around here.
He was so proud of them too, and stopped touring after they were born. So stayed more in town. He was a great guy, and he influenced a lot of people. I just saw where the Replacements are getting back together, and he produced their album here, right?
Yes, he did, and obviously the album was a huge hit at the time, and interestingly enough, it had the song Alex Chilton on it, Who's That Girl? What's that song?
Right.
And nobody can forget it. You hear it once. And,
Right. Well, now let me ask you this: Big Star started coming back. Was that because of the '70s show? Do you think?
No, it predated that.
Okay.
As I said, in 1978, EMI leased the masters from the new owners, which were Fantasy Records at the time, for #1 record in Radio City. Their 2 albums that were released on Ardent through Stack. And they put those out in the UK and Europe as a double fold-out vinyl, of which I had no knowledge until somebody told me about it and sent me. But then people started getting them into the US as imports, talking about them, and all of that sort of thing, which is why I say a lot of it was fed back from the UK and the European fan base. And then it kind of went around by word of mouth. In the 80s, the Bangles covered September Girls. A lot of other artists covered, in the 80s and going into the early 90s, like the UK artist, this Mortal Coil, covered some Big Star and some Chris Bell material. And there were various reissues. Fantasy finally woke up and reissued the first 2 records in the U.S., and then the 3rd album, sometimes called Sister Lovers or Big Star 3rd, which was the only one that was produced by Jim Dickinson. Because by that time, Alex said, "I think I need a producer. Can you get Jim Dickinson?" And I said, "Well, I'll sure try." And I called up, and he said, "Sure, I'd love to do it." And so we were off on a pretty wild ride for that one. And but that came out in the late 70s as a vinyl reissue and then CD on through various outlets. Again, all of these products are available today as very high quality reissues. #1 record in Radio City on vinyl, where it sounds the best.
Yeah.
From Concord, the current owner of the master rights. And 3rd on vinyl and CD, in a great form from the original analog tapes, all put together here for Omnivore Records. And the Chris Bell solo material, which Adam and I, worked on getting archived from the original tapes that existed, plus, doing some alternate mixes and things like that didn't exist. The high quality form of that is the 2-disc CD reissue from Rhino. I'm hopeful that we'll get Chris's solo album "I'm in the Cosmos" out on a high quality vinyl. It's out on vinyl now, but unfortunately the people who issued it saw fit to master it from an early 90s CD, so that sort of defeats the purpose of vinyl.
Right. Well, tell me, what makes a vinyl sound better than a CD?
Well, gosh, I can only tell you a little bit. First of all CDs don't sound bad. The recent CDs, the last 10 years, have suffered from what a lot of people call the loudness wars, where the artist or the producer comes in and says, "I want mine louder than everybody else's." So they apply all this excessive digital limiting and so forth and processing, and just squash all the dynamics out of it. And those things just practically make my teeth itch. I mean, it'll give you listener fatigue. All the high-end sizzles and splatters, and that's not what music sounds like. On the other hand, you get some 80s CDs or things that were mastered more like you would master for vinyl, without all of that excessive processing, and there's some great sounding CDs. Vinyl is an analog medium, and there's a lot of argument, which sounds better, analog or digital? Well, good digital can sound better than bad analog. But good analog sounds better than almost anything. And some of it is probably quantifiable. Normally, people that cut analog vinyl masters preserve the dynamics, the natural dynamics in the music. I know we do. Or Larry and Kevin Nix, who have their business here on Madison in our studio building. They still have, by the way, as an aside, they have the original vinyl lathe that was at Stax from 1970 to 75, and they've got it and it works, been completely refurbished, and we've recut stuff that we cut in the 70s, and you know, the masters and the parts had long since disappeared, so we recut it. Matches perfectly.
Does it really?
It does. And
Well, now he used that at Stax too, right?
oh, he did. He was
Yeah.
the mastering engineer there from 70 to 75. Again, to answer your question, why does analog on vinyl sound good? Well, that's an oxymoron. It's got to be analog if it's on vinyl. Why does vinyl sound so good?
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is because the mastering engineers and the producers tend to preserve the natural dynamics in the music. Part of it, I think, is because it's an analog medium, and you know, digital release media now have a relatively low sampling rate by comparison to the digital stuff we use in the studio today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's 44.1 kilohertz or cycles per second, which means the highest frequency it will reproduce is about 22,000 cycles per second. Well, you'd say, well, dogs can hear that. Well, there have been a lot of empirical tests done showing that people can hear and prefer systems that don't have, not to get too technical, a truncated bandwidth. So, I don't know, man, it just sounds good. and probably one of the best things about it is just the whole tactile experience of getting a nice big 12-inch by 12-inch thing where you can really look at the picture and the type is big enough to read it without a magnifying glass. And, you know, you get an actual thing to hold on to instead of, you know,
A file.
yeah, 5 inches square or instead of a file.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time, John. I know you're a busy man, but thank you for sitting down and talking with me.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it, and thank you and all Memphis Music